Dear students, today we will discuss the Arab conquest of Sindh, its nature and its impact. Now, the episode of the Arab conquest of Sindh in the 8th century led to the unfolding of an important political process in the Indic space. It subsequently resulted in Islamic military triumph and presence in the Indian subcontinent. Now, happenings in the Arab and Persian world provide a clue to these occurrences. Now, the birth of Islam in the middle of the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula initiated a period of rapid advancement of the religion both towards the west and the east. In fact, the Iberian Peninsula was its western outpost. Later, the Byzantine territories of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt came under its sway. Islam subsequently began to spread eastward towards Iraq, which was then ruled by the Sassanid dynasty. The Arabs forged ahead and penetrated central and eastern Persia, Khorasan, Sistan, and Transoxiana. All these events took place in the middle of the 7th and the early 8th centuries. Now, after the Sassanid dynasty, we find that the Umayyads came to power and subsequently they were followed by the Abbasids. So this was the area of Iran and Iraq over which the Umayyads and the Abbasids began to dominate. The Abbasids called themselves so because they were descended from the Prophet's uncle, Abbas. These ruling dynasties styled themselves caliphs. The Umayyad caliphs were eminently successful in extending the frontiers of their empire with the help of the important Arab clans, which had by now attained a dominant position in the region. Now, the strongest of the Umayyad caliphs was Abdul Malik. His full name was Al-Walid bin Abdul Malik. Now, Abdul Malik appointed Hajjaj, or Hajjaj bin Yusuf Saqafi, a veritable man of blood and iron, as governor of Khorasan and the whole of Iran and Turan. This initiated a new wave of Muslim expansion in the east. The Turks and the Tatars were brought to their knees, and Hajjaj emerged as the de facto ruler of the territories of the erstwhile Persian Empire. It was at the instigation of this aggressive Hajjaj that his nephew and son-in-law, Muhammad bin Qasim, invaded Sindh. Dahir was then the ruler in the area, and places like the port of Debal near Karachi, Nirun and Brahmanabad to the south and north of Hyderabad succumbed. Later on, the commercial centers of Siwan and Multan fell into the hands of bin Qasim in 712-13 CE. In fact, the whole of Lower and Upper Sindh were subjugated. Now, let us look at the literature which deals with this event. Now, this event has been recorded in the Chachnama by Ali Kufi, who penned his prose in Persian in the 13th century. Now, Ali Kufi lived in Uch, which was the political capital of Sindh. There was another work by Baladhuri, a historian of the 10th century, titled Kitab Futu al-Buldan. This book detailed the conquest of Sindh and possibly served as source material to Ali Kufi when he wrote his work. Now, Kitab Futu al-Buldan belongs to the genre of Futu narratives. This was the next stage of literary development after the Sirah literature. Sirah literature means biographies of the Prophet. Now, Baladuri himself depended on Madaini, who composed the earliest futu regarding the Islamic conquest of Sindh. In fact, Madaini's authenticity was highly respected because his work was based on authentic source material, on accounts of the soldiers who had participated in the war themselves. These historians provide rich information about the military offensive against Sindh. In fact, the futu contains crucial testimony about many things which were not directly related to Islam but were external to Islam. For example, we learn of the face-off with different communities. We learn of issues like taxation and conversion in the newly conquered areas from this futu literature. Now, the Chachnama gives us very interesting details about the province of Sindh and its political masters in the years immediately preceding the Arab invasion. We learn that Buddhism was the dominant belief system in the region around the 17th century. It was in this backdrop that a Brahmin named Chach ascended the throne in 632 CE. Chach was a very skilled warrior. And in fact, he brought the entire area from Sikka Multan to the seacoast under his control. He also had a victory over Chittor, and this was a very notable achievement on his part. Now, his spectacular success, therefore, neutralized whatever Buddhist resentment that came to the fore due to his meteoric rise. Chach ruled for nearly 4 decades. He largely desisted from hostility with the Buddhists, and there was an element of cooperation between the two. However, at the same period, we find that there was a gradual inclination towards Hinduism among the population of the region. A symbiotic relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism undergirded the social structure of the region around this time. Professor Muhammad Habib tells us that divisions of caste at this time were secular and not based on religion. Now, after a very successful rule of 4 decades, a struggle for power ensued between the sons of Chach. They were Dahir and his brother Dharsaya. In fact, Dahir had actually begun to rule 8 years after the death of his father. Ultimately, Dahir surmounted all challenges to his rule and was able to establish his control over Sindh. He remained in Brahmanabad in order to keep a watch on the neighboring chiefs. He visited Sivistan and Sevan and ordered that the construction of the fort of Rawar be completed. In fact, skilled military personnel manned his army, and his father's kingdom not only remained intact but strengthened rapidly. Now let us look at the geopolitical and geoeconomic background of this entire region. Now, the geopolitical structure and the geoeconomic circumstances had an impact on the region and on the way in which events were shaped here. Now, Arab seafarers were regular visitors right through the Arabian Sea across what is known as the Indian Ocean Arc. That is, the expansive waters stretching from the Red Sea to the South China Sea. In fact, the Indian Ocean Arc comprised the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Bay of Bengal, and the South China Sea. Now, between the Gulf and the western coast of India, there were trade routes. Trade routes from Muscat to Dabul or Debal, Surat, and Calicut. There were also routes traversing the Gulf and the eastern coast of Bengal, as well as the Andaman Islands and the Malay Peninsula. These routes were very important as they carried very rich trade to and fro. Now, these main routes were bolstered up by smaller maritime trade and land routes, stretching from the Red Sea region across the Arabian Peninsula. They merged with the Yemen, Sindh, and Gujarat routes. The constant journey of Chinese ships towards the Red Sea and of Arab dhows towards the South China Sea added to the cosmopolitan character of the region. Thus, Sindh, as a point in the Indian Ocean macrocosm, had a long association with Arabia. Indefatigable Arab traders and pilgrims also had a distinct presence here. Trigger behind this entire episode. Now, as I have said, that many Arab merchants had settled in Aden, Muscat, Diu, Thane, much before Islam had established imperial strongholds in Damascus and Baghdad. Ceylon and the East Indian Islands were also some of the places where these merchants made their homes. Now, the king of Ceylon sent a number of Mohammedan girls, daughters of Islamic merchants who had died in his territory, back to Hajjaj. But the ship that these girls were traveling in had been intercepted by pirates near Deval. When he became aware of this situation, Hajjaj immediately made a strong demand on Dahir for the release of these captives. Now, Dahir pleaded helplessness, saying that the miscreants were totally out of his control. As a result, a very angry Hajjaj sent retaliatory expeditions to this region. Now, these retaliatory expeditions were rebuffed, and then Hajjaj asked the Khalifa for permission for an outright aggression of Sindh. Perspectives by later and contemporary historians point out that the incident of the maids in distress took place about 10 years before the intrusion of Muhammad bin Qasim in the Sindh region. Baladhuri's account definitely asserts this. Yet, many historians, Andre Wink, for example, have foregrounded this episode as the principal trigger behind the invasion. But if we think logically, we can say that the Umayyad Caliphate had more cogent goals in mind when the territory in Sindh was penetrated, right? So, the Umayyad Caliphate had an important target of containing rebels. Who were these rebels? The proto-Shia groups like the Kharajites and Alawis from compromising their frontier. They also had the goal of getting financial gains for themselves from this region. They also had the goal of securing trade routes and outposts, right? So, in fact, the fact that the maids in distress were the actual trigger is now disputed by recent scholarship. We must remember that Sindh was regarded as the frontier with the house of gold. In other words, there was plentiful resource around this region, and the Umayyad Caliphate set their eyes on these rich resources of the area. Now let us look at the story of the conquest, right? Now 17-year-old Muhammad bin Qasim, cousin and son-in-law of Hajjaj, was a military commander par excellence. In 712, he led the assault on Dewal with a well-equipped army comprising cavalry and camel corps. A flotilla of boats carrying heavy catapults arrived at the mouth of the Indus from the Persian Gulf. This arrangement had been made by Hajjaj himself. Now, the capitulation of Dewal was speedy, preceded by the extermination of Brahmin priests of its main temple. Muhammad bin Qasim left behind a garrison in Dewal and then moved to Nirun or Hyderabad. He was met by the Buddhist governor there, who had earlier been promised protection by Hajjaj in return for payment of annual tribute. Muhammad bin Qasim appointed a governor here and levied kharaj, which was a tax on them. Henceforth, massacres of Brahmins and Buddhists were avoided because the young general probably realized that such violence, perpetration of such violence was futile because the populace was willing to submit to him anyway. Now, Islamic texts have highlighted the role of the priestly class as the principal negotiators with the aggressors. These texts have also talked about a sort of non-military engagement between the army and the local people. After capturing Nirun or Hyderabad, Sivistan was taken after a brief opposition from its governor. The Indus was traversed and the direct attack was now made on Dahir. Now, Dahir, in the meantime, had done very little to prepare himself for this frontal attack which was made on him by Muhammad bin Qasim. In fact, we find that the fort of Rawar was witness to a really bloody battle in which Dahir excelled personally but lost his life and kingdom. The Arabs now moved forward to Brahmanabad, which was still being heroically guarded by Dahir's son Jaisya. They stormed the city with the tacit support of the civil population, who were ready to submit to bin Qasim in exchange for protection of their life and property. So, with the seizure of Brahmanabad, southern Sindh came under bin Qasim's control. It is now that Muhammad bin Qasim actually became a part of the past of the Indic space. The next two targets were Alor and Multan. Once more, Muhammad bin Qasim settled administrative matters in Brahmanabad, and then he was ordered by Hajjaj to proceed towards northern Sindh, that is Alor and Multan. Alor had been left in the charge of another son of Dahir's, who was still under the illusion that the news of his father's death was false. In a repeat of the earlier incident, the populace submitted to the Islamic intruders, and Dahir's son, in fact, ultimately fled the scene. Thus, we find that the Muslim generals' assurances that temples would not be desecrated and neither Buddhism or Hinduism disrespected perhaps turned the tide of popular sentiment in favor of the young conqueror, both at Brahmanabad and at Alor. Now, having compromised the forts of Habiba and Sikka, the young general proceeded to Multan on the other side of the river Ravi. After a month's siege, Multan was subjugated and his hands fell on enormous treasure. In fact, the entire Sindh expedition turned out to be very lucrative for Muhammad bin Qasim. He sent major portions of his gains to Hajjaj, and Hajjaj, in his turn, was able to satiate his master, Caliph Walid. 60 million dirham had been spent by the Umayyads in Sindh. This resulted in a net yield of 120 million dirham. Now, Muhammad bin Qasim had unending ambition, right? We find that the place that he had actually invaded was absolutely beautiful. The landscape and the nature had all its bounty there. So the beauteous landscape where the river Jhelum merged into the foothills of Kashmir beckoned Muhammad bin Qasim. A poplar and a fir had been planted by Rai Church as a demarcating line between his kingdom and Kashmir. To these, the young general added one of his own. Now, the young general, who was quite heady with his success by now, sent a proposal to Rai Harchandar of Kannauj, the strongest political potentate of the region, to accept Islam or face his aggression. His time in Lower Sindh, his military offensive, and his strategy of winning over the local populace first by assuring them of their physical, material, and religious safety had made him bold enough to dream big. The alarmed local populace usually submitted to him first, and this paved the way for the capitulation of the Hindu rulers. So Muhammad bin Qasim was convinced that he could take on the strongest potentate of Hindustan and with time even reach the borders of China. On being rebuffed by Rai Chandar, bin Qasim was all geared up for an onslaught. But at this juncture, he was recalled to his native states. Dark clouds had gathered at home for the young man. In fact, the political situation there had undergone transformation with the death of bin Qasim's patron Hajjaj and his distant master Caliph Walid. The new Caliph Sulaiman was a sworn enemy of Hajjaj, and he was bent on a purge of all those associated with him. Thus, the fate of the young and dashing commander was sealed. A cruel death awaited him, and he had no option but to submit to this dark inevitability. Now let us look at the consequences of this entire episode. Now, the initial phase of occupation instituted a superimposition of Arab rule over an essentially indigenous political structure. The inhabitants of Sindh acquired the status of zimmis, or protected people, who were brought within the ambit of jizya or poll tax. Soldiers and prisoners of war were dealt with severely, though mass conversions were desisted from, and the new dispensation ruled in collaboration with the Brahmins. Where governance was concerned, we can perhaps hark back to Hajjaj's eastern forays, which in many ways were quite illuminating. In fact, Hajjaj and his way of conducting war may have served as a template for his young lieutenant bin Qasim. Professor Muhammad Habib tells us that Hajjaj's principal target had been expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate. Here, manslaughter and bloodshed were the main pillars of his war strategy. However, we find that spiritual upliftment of those whom he had subjugated was not really high on his agenda. Imposing jizya on them assumed importance, while religious and social customs were largely left untampered with. Bin Qasim, on his part, was discerning enough to utilize the assistance of local experienced administrators. In fact, he freely appointed Hindus to important positions. Sisakar, Minister of Dahir, was made the Wazir, while Kaksa, son of Chandwar was Chach's brother, became his reliable officer and guide in northern Sindh. The Brahmins too were given a number of official responsibilities in the districts as revenue managers. And Hindu Thakurs and chiefs were generally left to their own devices as long as they swore allegiance to the new regime and paid tribute. A division of society into classes that existed at that time was recognized. Again, Brahmins too were recognized as a superior class. Now, this sort of attitude resulted in a graded imposition of jizya or poll tax. Kharaj, or a tax on land holdings, also continued to be collected. However, desecration of temples was desisted from. Baladuri's writings indicate that none of Islam's apprehensions and concerns about idolatry and polytheism gained prominence during this period. In fact, we find a number of inscriptions in Gujarat around this time, 736 to 39, where the Muslims are called or are referred to as Tajika, Turushka, or Parasika. These inscriptions also talk about a young prince Pulakesi Raja of the Chalukyas defeating the Muslim forces at Navasarika. In fact, Pulakesi Raja was bestowed a title as a reward by the Chalukya king Ballava for this feat. This information was inscribed on a copper plate. Now, after Bin Qasim was compelled to return to Iraq, the new governor of Sindh was Junaid. Right. He was the representative of the next Umayyad Caliph Abdul Aziz and instituted a perceptible change in policy. We find that local potentates were now compelled to adopt Islam, ushering in a phase of rebellion and protest. But Junaid's ambitious projects to move beyond Sindh were thwarted, and he was recalled in 740 CE. As the Umayyads gave way to the Abbasids, the political relationship with Sindh became a long-term one, but also was more chaotic, filled with disruption and carnage. A number of Arab governors were stationed at Sindh, but many refused to bow down to the Abbasid regime. And the contentious issue, the reason why they refused to swear allegiance to the Abbasids was the contentious issue of control of rich revenue from the Sindh region. In fact, here we see that Kharajites and Iyer clans also stepped in, trying to claim their share of the revenue from the Indic frontier. There were also instances of the founding of city-states in the region, the earliest one being the port city of Sindhan in Gujarat in the 9th century. In fact, 2 generations of the Mahania, right, who were descendants of Fazal bin Mahan, who had actually captured Sindhan, controlled this port and also tried to control the pirates in the region. Principalities also later emerged in Mansura and subsequently Multan. Now, these cities and governors were descendants of Abu Talib, and they were Shiites, though in this case we find that these Shiites pledged allegiance to the Abbasids. Now, these cities, however, were unable to make a mark outside their boundaries because we find that they only depended on revenue from pilgrims and travelers, right? In the meanwhile, there was a constant flood of migration from the Arab and from the Arabian and the Yemeni coasts into this region. So we find that even though the Arabs were unable to proceed much beyond the Indus, their authority over Sindh persisted right till the 10th century. Of course, there was a lot of power politics, but the Arabs maintained their authority over Sindh till the 10th century. A large infiltration of Hadith scholars and jurists into the port cities of this area somewhat changed the demographic character here. There was intense infighting in the Abbasid polity in Baghdad, and therefore links with Sindh weakened after the 10th century. We find that instead of the Arabs, we find that Ismailis were flooding into this area, were coming into this area, right? Their missionary activity proliferated in this area, and they came and settled here from the Yemeni port cities, especially in the region, to the region around Multan. Now, the Ismailis were actually aligned to the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. Right, we find, so then we find that political equations with Baghdad remain volatile, though cross-regional trade continued. And this can be seen or proved by pottery and coins, which were found in places like Samara, Fustat, Mansoura, and Deval. Now, Muhammad bin Qasim's spree of aggression in Sindh has been adjudged as the beginning of many things, but especially of conquest. A consultation with Islamic texts of the time would prove that the Sindh region was dotted with multiple courts and polities which attracted a varied sort of population into the region. Moreover, as we have said earlier, Sindh was an essential node in the Indian Ocean region and was interconnected with Arabia and Iran from the 7th century onwards. From the 8th century, mercantile settlements and the existence of diverse political communities here helped broaden the scope of the initial thrust behind the Arab invasion. So, perhaps we may logically say that trade was the first point of contact with the Arab world, only to be followed by conquest. Now, Professor Rizvi tells us that this was a period of toleration and synthesis, right? So, he says that the entire chain of events in Sindh has been regarded very dismissively by some historians. Perhaps the reason behind this is that the threats and incursions into India diminished for almost 3 centuries hereafter. Even historians of the medieval age, such as Isami and Badauni, are reluctant to concede the importance of the Arab presence. However, Professor Rizvi tells us that certain implicit lessons can be garnered from this experience. He thinks that the principle of toleration and cooperation on the part of the Arabs ensured peaceful domination and allowed Arab and Sindhi tribal mores to exist and imbibe from each other. The two cultures did not clash but synthesized instead. In fact, Arab sources tell us that in the urban space, both Arabic and Sanskrit were spoken. Right. There was an element of exchange of technology, leather polishing techniques, for example, and better facilities for Arab trade. An atmosphere of exchange of intellectual knowledge prevailed. Recommendations for translating Sanskrit works on astronomy, medicine, ethics, and administration were forwarded to the Caliphate. Attempts were also made to become familiar with Muslim scientific theories. Many craftsmen, in fact, moved from the Sindh region into Gujarat during this period. Therefore, we can say that the Arab footprint on the threshold of India, long before the proper imposition of Islamic rule in the heartland, brought into focus an element of symbiosis. And this was to remain one of the most enduring features of the culture of the Indic space. Thank you.